raconteur author, Will Friedwald, who's on our board, and I'll introduce him, and then he'll introduce Gary Giddins and our wonderful program on Bing Crosby. Welcome, Will Friedwald. His Nat King Cole book will be coming out this year, too. All right.
I think the singer midgets were just here. How do you do this? Oh, there we are. I'm such a wonderful producer. I completely loused up the time. Gary has to leave at 1 p.m. sharp. So for the next hour, we will primarily talk about this wonderful series of books he's doing on Bing Crosby. And then at 1, we will have clippage, copious clippage. You know I'm always about that. And possibly Eric and Barbara, if they are so moved, to do an encore. But Linda did not tell you. The reason Eric really wanted to do, by the way, this is welcome to the APSS, where we save the best for first. The reason Eric wanted to be here is because Eric and Gary and I have all known each other. The three of us have known each other since, I'm going to say, 83, 84. And it's not like Gary is all that much older than we are, but when Eric and I, Eric's line is we have the same alma mater, Tower Records. And when Eric and I were both, we actually were both attending NYU at the time. Of course, at that point it was called New Amsterdam University. And while we were matriculating, there's a word, we were trying to learn everything we possibly could about American music, about jazz and the Great American Songbook. And of course we were kids in a candy store. We both worked full-time at Tower Records. But the real way we learned about everything, and again, he's not that much older than we are, was by reading every word of Gary Giddins. Writing on a Blue Note was out by then, and I think Eric and I literally memorized every essay in that book, and we would wait every 2 weeks for a new Weatherbird in the Village Voice, a new Weatherbird column, which he did for 33 years? 31 years. Even then, when Whitney Balliet and Martin Williams were still actively writing, Gary was my all-time favorite writer on music, all music, especially jazz, but also the Great American Songbook, also rock and roll, also classical, also movie music, also film. Even when I think those are the only two real rivals or contenders, Martin Williams and Whitney Balliet, but even then Gary was my favorite. Now, I think it's beyond question that Gary is the greatest living writer on music, without any competition, present company very much included, and just a phenomenal writer. And what he has done for the cause of my favorite singer, the guy that really got me interested in the whole breadth and scope of American music, was Bing Crosby. And I am so grateful to Gary for doing this series of books, and he's added so much, contributed so much to our experience of Bing Crosby, our enjoyment of Bing Crosby, our appreciation for him. The first book was miraculous. I read it twice in the first year that it came out. I've only read the second volume once so far, but it's just, you might make a case for Peter Guralnick and his Elvis 2-volume set, but really, this is, I don't think there's much competition to say that this is the greatest, most in-depth, most informative, most wonderful biography of a major figure in American music. I just don't think there's any competition. I wish there were more competition. Anyhow, I can't say enough about this man. I used to say that he was the father of my career, but I'm afraid Gary would demand a blood test. So, anyhow, I can't say enough about him in this wonderful series of books. This is the great Gary Giddins. We need some chairs, right? We think of everything but chairs.
You want the high chairs?
Do you want the high chairs or you want the regular chairs?
These are fine.
Oh, there's a high chair there? Okay.
Here's one here.
Oh.
I think these.
Do we need another mic or? Again, we think of, the piano mic.
The piano mic.
Oh, we think of everything except the important stuff. Am I going to get in trouble with the Stagehands Union? Take that, Mike. Oh. Marty, help!
Just take it out. It's a
Or just take it out,
cordless
just
mic.
hold it? I'm going to feel too much like Phil Donahue.
It's a cordless mic. Just take it out.
Okay, well, I'd rather have it on a stand.
Really?
I guess the most obvious question is, when Volume 1 came out, we breathlessly raced through it to get to the end, and it covers exactly half of Crosby's career, up until the point where he was 39 or something, 37? Whoa. I'm no Marty. Maybe I should just hold it.
Just hold them.
At what point did you decide, I know people were clamoring for Volume 2 for 15 years. When did you decide to make Volume 2, to focus on what you make the point, and beyond the shadow of a doubt, that the war years, 1940 to 46, are the high point of Crosby's career. They certainly were the high point of his popularity in terms of being the #1 grossing male star in film, the top-rated radio program, and the single biggest figure in the recording industry by a considerable margin. But when did you decide to make Volume 2 just about the war years, to focus on that period?
While I was researching the first volume, I interviewed about 300 people, and the one person who I could not get to sit down was Mrs. Crosby, Catherine Crosby, his widow. And I spoke, her children all gave me interviews, and Rosemary Clooney valiantly tried to bring us together on a couple of occasions, and she just wouldn't talk to me. And then after the first volume came out, a number of people actually who had refused me interviews because of all of the hatchet jobs that had been done on Crosby, the two anyway, changed their mind. And Harry Crosby, Catherine's oldest son, called her and said, "Mom, you need to read this book." And so she did, and then she invited me out to the house in Hillsborough. And could not have been more gracious. Basically, she opened the house to me I stayed there for about a week, I think, the first time, and went through all of Crosby's file cabinets and desks, and I could not believe the things that I found. I thought I had a sense of the man pretty well, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, of letters from the families of servicemen who had been killed. In mourning, they chose to write to Crosby. In most instances, because their sons had seen Crosby overseas when he had gone over to France and England after D-Day. And in some instances, because they had seen him in the countless tours that he had done in the United States. But they had all written back to their family, and their letters were there, copies of their letters that the survivors sent. And it just gave me a whole different sense. And at one point, Catherine saw how moved I was, and she said, "I cry every time I look at those." And I was nearing tears. Anyway, Mrs. Crosby told me that there was a place we'd photocopy and just make a pile of what you need. So I was madly making notes on everything I could find, but there was just too much to make notes, and things that were way too long that I wanted to have in their entirety, I was making on a pile on the kitchen table, and after 4 or 5 days, the pile was a few feet high. And finally, it was the day before I left, I said, "Mrs. Crosby," actually I was calling her Catherine by then, I said, "Catherine, it's going to take hours to do this copying. I don't know how we're going to, work this out." And she said, "Wait a second, I have an idea." And she ran out of the room and came back with an old World War II era suitcase that you don't see anymore. And she said, "Just take everything, I trust you, and send them back after you've copied them or you're done with them." So I did, and there was stuff there that I really hadn't looked at that deeply. And then, unbelievably, a few months later, I got a call from the person who runs the Crosby estate pretty much now. And he said they found a whole new storage locker but Robert Bader in Nevada, and there were thousands of letters there, mostly professional related. And that he had spoken to Catherine, and Catherine had said that I could see everything after it's been vetted, as long as it didn't concern things that were still in play in the will. So I hired a researcher out there, and she would go up to his house every, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks, take another 200 pages, photocopy them, send them to me. The problem with something like that is, you know, you have to read through all this stuff, and most of it is not particularly useful. It's just very day-to-day professional things. But every once in a while there'd be a letter that would just set me back on my heels. So I realized that there was a story here about the war that nobody knew. It had never been written about. Nobody knew really anything about what Crosby did in France, how close he was to the fighting, because Crosby was so modest to a fault. But on the war issues, he felt that it would be somehow a personal disgrace to try to exploit what he had done. I mean, these men sacrificed their lives and limbs, and families were destroyed, and he was not going to make a big thing about how, you know, what he did. He really didn't think it was much of anything. And if you've read Call Me Lucky, to me now the most amazing thing about Call Me Lucky is that the Second World War gets half of one sentence, and the half sentence is to make him the butt of a joke. He just wouldn't deal with it. And then Catherine called me up and said, I'm coming to New York to visit my new grandchild, and I found something that I think will interest you. Come to Harry's house and meet me. So I went over there, and she gave me the original transcripts that were done for Call Me Lucky. When I first looked at it, I thought, well, this is interesting, but I was paging through them, and it looked like what would be most interesting, and it would be a couple of sentences for me, was that how close the original tapes were to the finished book, because I knew the finished book pretty well, and I was recognizing a lot of the lines. But then I took them home and actually started reading them, and the crossouts were all done in pencil, not like FBI files that are completely blacked out. You could erase them and the lines, and you could pretty much see what had been changed and what wasn't. But the most remarkable thing to me were the conversations in between the long narratives that Crosby gives with his co-author, Pete Martin of the Saturday Evening Post. And at one point, Bing says, is this more detailed than you were asking?
No, keep going. Go, man, go.
He said to Pete, listen, when I was overseas, I kept a journal. It's the only one I ever kept. I don't know if there's anything in it, but here it is. Maybe you'll find something useful. Martin didn't bother to read it. He just gave it back to him. And this was incredible to me. And in any case, one of the reasons that book took so long is that eventually I was able to get hold of that journal. And spent, I don't know, a month. If you know the movie Blow Up, where he keeps blowing up pictures and putting them all over the wall, I did this with I made photocopies of every single page. I think there were like 75, 80 pages, and kept enlarging them so I could make out his handwriting in a few instances where I wasn't too sure. And at the same time, I was making Google Maps. Never had a better client. I was mapping all of France and putting those up against the wall. And at this point, I just knew that this was the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write the book about his experience in the war. And also, I wanted to write a lot about Leo McCarey, because I found Leo McCarey's archive at the University of Southern California, and nobody had ever accessed it. There had never been a serious biography of McCarey. There had been 3 very superficial books, And none of those biographers bothered to go through his archive. I was just stunned.
Huh.
So I knew I was gonna, and I love McCarry, and I love McCarry's career. I just find it utterly fascinating.
In case anybody isn't aware, Leo McCarry's two great contributions to world culture are Laurel and Hardy and Going My Way.
And Bells of
Father
St.
O'Malley,
Mary,
yeah, and Father O'Malley.
And the best Marx Brothers movie, Duck Soup, and it's just an amazing career. And so I went to my editor at Little Brown and I said, listen, I want to do this new volume. It's just going to be about the war. And he said, not a chance. He said, you have a contract for 2 volumes, you can't do it. So I was very upset and I went to my agent and my agent said, what do you care? By the time you're finished, he will have been fired. Which is exactly what happened. So the new editor came in, and because now I had actually written a few hundred pages. When I went to the first editor, I hadn't written anything. I had just been organizing my notes. But now I had like 300 pages done. And he came in, and I didn't ask. I just said, you know, I'm doing just the war in this volume. And he said, oh no, I didn't realize that. And I said, well, listen, I have 300 pages, you know. He said, I have to get permission for that. He called me back. And I said, well, you don't have to go in naked. I can give you actually 300 pages, and if you think I'm crazy, let me know. So he took the pages and he read them, and he liked them a lot. And then he took them to the head of Little Brown, Reagan Arthur, and she liked it. And they said, they got back to me, Reagan, and she said, we'll let you do the book you want to do with one proviso. We won't be legally obligated to do the 3rd volume if, you know, it completely fails. And I said, that's reasonable, and I agreed to that. So at that point, I knew pretty much what the parameters were. My original idea was to end in 49, but after 600 pages, when I was still in 45, I realized that wasn't going to happen. And so that's basically how that book came. It just seemed to me to have a perfect beginning and a middle and an end. And also, those of you who've read the book will know what I'm referring to here, but I also met one of the 2 surviving Barca sisters, two women who, when they were teenagers, actually one of them was in her 20s at the time, they stalked Bing for several years and kept a diary of everything. I mean, they outed his relationship with Joan Caulfield. They never would, you know, out it to anybody. Nobody had ever seen the diary, not even their family, not even their kids. Nobody had ever seen it. But through a long series of accidental communications, I heard about it, and finally she gave me that journal. So now I actually had a day-by-day diary, practically, of what Bing did for the month that he lived in New York.
Yeah.
At the end of 45, 2 months actually, the last month of 45 and the first month of 46. I mean, it was a biographer's dream. You know, the great photographer Herman Leonard once advised me a long time ago, and I've never forgotten this because it's so true. I had asked him how he got a certain effect in a photograph, and he said, you can't do that on purpose. All you could do is train yourself to be lucky. And I really live by that mantra.
Call me lucky.
You train yourself to be open to things, and then they look like luck, but somehow you prepared the way for them. And between all of these things, and the Barces gave me the perfect ending for the book, so that's how it happened.
Well, Gary knew Rosemary Clooney much better than I did, but I knew her pretty well. Give myself a little credit. She was an amazing woman. I interviewed her a lot on Frank Sinatra when she was still playing Rainbow and Stars every year. And we were talking a lot about Sinatra, and then Crosby came up. And what Rosemary said was really amazing. She said, people think that Sinatra is dark and mysterious and Bing is warm and friendly, which is true to a degree. But she said, having known them both, I would say that Sinatra is much more open and expressive and honest. And not that Bing is dishonest, but much more honest in his emotions. And when you see Sinatra express an emotion, that's really what he's feeling in the moment. Whereas, on the other hand, Crosby is much, much harder to get to know. It's much, she thought that he was much more shady, not shady, but mysterious and dark and closed off from the world. And she said she really had to work at getting to know him. And I think that one of the real triumphs of Volume 2, even above Volume 1, which was a masterpiece, was that you really get inside Bing's head. And there's whole universes that I never even imagined, like Crosby's dissatisfaction with his radio series. And it's just not, we do know that eventually he helps pioneer the use of audio tape and then videotape 10 years later, but which grows out of his dissatisfaction with the status quo of live radio. But on both a personal level and a professional level, Gary gets inside his head like I didn't think anybody would ever be able to do, especially even after having read Volume 1. And the light that he sheds on the relationship with Dixie Lee was just, like I say, when I'm reading it, I'm reading stuff that I didn't think that anybody would ever be able to know. I mean, I've been a Crosby fan since he was alive. And I started listening to Crosby and collecting his records in like 74, 75 when I was 12 years old. And I just assumed that we would really never know what was going on in the Crosby household. I was a Bing fan before the Hatchet books came out and revealed that, yes, there was serious dysfunction, to put it kind of mildly. But you must have been astonished as you put all that together. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship of Bing and Dixie and the kids and all that, the first family?
Yeah, but first let me just say two things. One, when I started on the book, I went immediately to Will, and Will had this amazing collection of just notes he had taken and all kinds of stuff and LPs that were out of print, and he basically turned everything over to me. I'll never forget that. So I really can't acknowledge that enough. Will was a real inspiration on Crosby and on a lot of things. And talked about
I had
great
hair
books.
back then.
Anyway, one of the things that I found in that locker in Nevada was, again, this is the biographer's dream. Nobody understood that Bing had one reputation that he was very proud of and that nobody ever really penetrated, not even Gary Crosby in his book, which was that he was stable, very solid. Depression was unknown to him. He was always in control. Nobody ever heard him raise his voice. Everybody who knew him really well would say to me, when Bing got angry, you could tell because his eyes went from blue to turquoise. But he never raised his voice. Was it Maxine Andrews said you could tell when Bing walked into a recording session, if he wore the hat on the back of his head, you knew you were going to have a great time. If he wore it low down, you knew it was all business, just singing, and he was off to the golf course. That kind of thing. So everything was very close. So when Bing decided to give up the radio show, the first thing you mentioned, which nobody ever knew about, it never made any newspaper, Variety, anything, he demanded a conference with someone he had not really spoken to before, the head of the Kraft food company, a man named McInerney, who also created Hydrox and Breakstone Cottage Cheese. He owned all of these companies. He was a very powerful figure. And Crosby went to speak with him for an hour in which he really let down his hair. And then, amazingly, McInerney called the head of production for the Kraft Music Hall and told him exactly what Crosby had said. I mean, gave him an almost line-for-line recollection, which John Reber, the guy who was the producer of the show, creator of the show, really, wrote down and then had transcribed. And then he made a letter with this complete record of this and sent it to only 3 people who were to destroy it afterwards. And there was a copy of it. So I was like in the room with Crosby confessing that his despair, his feeling that he was losing his ability, that the radio show was no longer fun, that he didn't think he had anything to give anymore. And this is another reason why the war story is so important, because once we get into the fight, and he starts meeting these troops and performing everywhere, selflessly, the despair lifts. He finally has a reason to go on. So you can't divorce the fact of the war and what he did in it from the fact that his whole career, his whole art reaches some new level in this period. This is the period of the Father O'Malley films and, you know, some of his best jazz recordings and on and on and on. As far as Dixie, again, I found some incredibly candid letters. One group of 5 letters that shows how much Dixie was in love with him was stolen from the house, and I was able to track down to somebody who got hold of them somehow. We don't really know how or who stole them, but they were undoubtedly stolen. And he called me. I called him up, and I said, "Can I see copies of it?" He was unbelievably rude, one of the rudest people. And he said, "I'm going to burn them before I let you see them. Before I go, they will." I said, "Well, that's very helpful." So
He stole them right out of the house.
After he died, the guy who edited the great Bing fan magazine of that period, Bing Gang, which was in the United States, Mark Stringer, said, so-and-so who had the letters, he didn't burn them. He gave me copies. And Mark sent them to me immediately, so I had those. And then just a lot of things unfolded, and including a letter from Dixie's father, which I reproduce in the book, and which is chilling, absolutely bone-chilling. And then I had spoken to a lot of people in the family, and one day I was sitting in my office. It was a Sunday night. I'm not usually in my office on a Sunday evening, but again, luck. The phone rings, and it's Philip Crosby, one of the twins. Philip. There's 4 children in the original marriage.
Is he the last one surviving?
Well, he's gone now, but he, at that time he was.
Right.
So when I interviewed Gary, Gary made a condition. I could choose either him or Phil, but he couldn't talk to both because they hated each other's guts, and they hadn't talked to each other in years and years and years. It never did. Gary said, his brother Philip was a Nazi, and he lives, among all these crazy, gun people in Idaho, and I tried to get to Phil, and I didn't get anywhere. So I thought, well, the bird in the hand. So, and Gary was more important to me because I wanted to take him through his own book, page by page by page, which I did, and discovered that he had not really written the book and hadn't even read a lot of it. So that was very useful, especially for the first volume. But now Gary's dead. He died of a heart attack. I think he was just 62. And I'm sitting in my office Sunday night, and it's Philip. I didn't even know how he got my number. And I couldn't get him off the phone. He was on a lot of uppers at the time. And finally, after 2 hours, madly writing down everything I can as fast as I can, I said, "Philip, you're wearing me out. Can we continue this?" "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said. "I didn't really mean to hold you." I said, "Are you kidding? This is just wonderful that you called." And so we started a regular thing of like once a week we would talk for an hour or so. And whatever Gary said, Phil said exactly the opposite. But Phil, because he worshipped his father and had more problems with his mother, gave me an insight into the marriage that would have simply been unavailable to me. And eventually, one of the things I did with this book that I hadn't done with the first, I occasionally, Robert Caro, you all know Robert Caro, the greatest living biographer in the English language, and maybe even not living greatest biographer in the English language. But Caro really steeled me on this book because I told him when they initially refused, and he said, screw them, just write the book you want to write. They'll have to publish it. And he was just really good about getting me to think through things. Anyway,